Imagine living in a place where everyone knows your name, where Friday night football games bring the whole town together. And the biggest worry is whether Mrs. Henderson's apple pie will win first place at the county fair again. A place where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on, and parents never think twice about letting them walk to school alone. This was Acme, Washington, in 1989. A tiny logging community nestled in the shadow of the North Cascade Mountains, where trust wasn't just expected, it was a way of life. The kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked and helped their neighbors without being asked. But sometimes, the most peaceful places harbor the darkest secrets. And sometimes, evil finds its way into paradise. On a crisp November morning in 1989, that peace would be shattered forever. A young woman's life would be stolen, a family would be destroyed, and an entire community would discover that safety is just an illusion. This is the story of Mandy Stavik, and the case that haunted a small town for nearly 3 decades. 18-year-old Amanda Stavik was everything you'd want in a daughter. Bright, athletic, ambitious, the kind of girl who lit up every room she entered. She'd been the star of her high school basketball team, a cheerleader, and one of the top students in her graduating class. Everyone called her Mandy, and everyone loved her. After graduating from Mount Baker High School, Mandy had headed off to Central Washington University with dreams of becoming a commercial airline pilot. It was an ambitious goal for a young woman in the late 80s, but those who knew Mandy weren't surprised. She'd always been determined to reach for the sky. Thanksgiving weekend 1989 found Mandy back home in Acme, taking a break from her freshman year of college. She was excited to spend time with her family, catch up with old friends, and enjoy the familiar comfort of the place she'd grown up. The day after Thanksgiving, November 24th, dawned clear and cold. It was the kind of crisp autumn day that made you want to get outside and breathe in the mountain air. For Mandy, who'd been a runner throughout high school, it was the perfect morning for a jog. She'd developed a routine during her years at Mount Baker High. Almost every day, she'd lace up her running shoes, clip a leash on her German Shepherd Kira, and head out onto the rural roads that wound through the countryside around Acme. It was her time to think, to clear her head, and to stay in the kind of shape that had made her such a formidable athlete. That Friday morning was no different. Mandy pulled on her running clothes, said goodbye to her family, and headed out with Kira by her side. She planned to follow her usual route, a path that would take her along Strand Road, past farmhouses and wooded areas, through the heart of the community she called home. It should have been just another run, but Mandy Stavik would never make it home. Hours passed, then more hours. As the afternoon wore on and evening approached, Mandy's family began to worry. She was responsible, reliable, not the type to disappear without explanation. When darkness fell and she still hadn't returned, they knew something was terribly wrong. The search began immediately. Friends, neighbors, family members, everyone who could help, fanned out across the rural roads and forest trails around Acme. They called her name until their voices were hoarse. They searched with flashlights long into the night. Kira, Mandy's faithful German Shepherd, had returned home alone earlier that day. The dog was agitated, pacing nervously, as if trying to communicate something she couldn't express. But where was Mandy? For 3 agonizing days, the search continued. Volunteers scoured every inch of the countryside. Helicopters circled overhead. Boats searched the rivers and streams that cut through the landscape. The entire community came together, united in their desperate hope to bring Mandy home safely. But hope turned to horror on November 27th. Detective Ron Peterson was part of the search team that day. He'd been methodically working his way along the south fork of the Nooksack River in his Zodiac boat when something caught his eye. There, in a quiet side channel away from the main river, he spotted something pink floating in the dark water. It was Mandy. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. This wasn't supposed to happen in Acme. This wasn't supposed to happen anywhere, but especially not here, in their safe haven tucked away from the troubles of the wider world. As investigators began to piece together what had happened, a terrifying picture emerged. Mandy hadn't simply had an accident. She hadn't gotten lost or fallen into the river. Someone had deliberately taken her life. The evidence suggested that Mandy had been abducted while out on her run, likely by someone in a vehicle. She was too fast a runner to be caught on foot. Investigators reasoned her attacker had probably used a weapon to force her compliance, then taken her to a location several miles from her jogging route. What happened next was every parent's worst nightmare. Mandy had been sexually assaulted, but she hadn't given up without a fight. Scratches on her arms and legs suggested she'd tried to escape, running through blackberry bushes in a desperate attempt to get away from her attacker. In the end, her efforts weren't enough. Her killer had caught up with her, knocked her unconscious, and then placed her in the river to ensure she wouldn't survive. For Detective Peterson, who had children of his own, the case was deeply personal. As he recovered Mandy's body from the cold water, he whispered words that no parent should ever have to say. The memory of that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. The investigation that followed was intense and thorough. Tips poured in from concerned citizens. Police interviewed dozens of potential suspects. They looked at everyone from local drifters to Mandy's own boyfriend, methodically working to rule out each possibility. One early person of interest was David Succi, a transient who'd been seen in the area on the day of Mandy's disappearance. But when investigators obtained his DNA, it didn't match evidence found at the crime scene. In fact, despite collecting DNA samples from 30 different men in the area, investigators came up empty. None of the samples matched. The case that had started with such promise, with physical evidence that should have led directly to the killer, suddenly hit a brick wall as months turned to years. The Mandy Stavik case began to go cold. The detective assigned to it would change. Files would be boxed up and stored away. The daily urgency that had driven the investigation would fade. But the impact on the community never did. In a place like Acme, everyone knew everyone. Mandy's murder didn't just take away a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. It stole something more fundamental, the sense of security that had defined life in this small town. Parents who had never worried about their children playing outside after dark suddenly found themselves checking locks twice before bed. Runners who had felt safe on the rural roads began looking over their shoulders. The easy trust that had been the foundation of community life was replaced by a nagging fear that the killer was still out there, still among them. Years passed, a decade, then another. The case remained officially open, but with each passing year, it seemed less likely that justice would ever be served. Mandy's family never stopped hoping, never stopped asking questions, but even they began to wonder if they would ever know the truth about what happened to their daughter. 25 years would pass before everything changed. 25 years before a casual conversation at a water park would crack the case wide open. 25 years before the people of Acme would finally learn that the monster they'd feared was someone they'd known all along. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Two mothers, sitting on the grass at a local water park, watching their children splash down slides and play in the summer sun. They barely knew each other. These women, Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, but they shared a connection that went back decades to their high school years at Mount Baker High. It was June 2013, and somehow the conversation turned to Mandy Stavik. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught the water, or the sound of children laughing, that made them think of innocence lost, whatever prompted it. When Mandy's name came up, both women felt something stir inside them, a recognition, a shared suspicion they'd carried in silence for far too long. I just turned to Marilee and said, "Well, I'm sure I know who killed her," Heather would later recall. And she turned to me and said, "Oh, I do too." The name that came from both their lips was Timothy Bass. Tim Bass had been just another face in the halls of Mount Baker High School back in the late 80s. He wasn't particularly memorable, not a star athlete, not a troublemaker, not someone who stood out in any obvious way. He was just there, part of the background of small-town life. But for both Heather and Marilee, Tim Bass had been anything but forgettable. Each woman had experienced encounters with him that had left them deeply unsettled. Encounters they'd never spoken about publicly, but had never been able to shake. For Heather, the memory went back to the summer of 1989, just months before Mandy's murder. She was 15 years old, sitting in a friend's truck after a softball game, when Tim Bass, then in his 20s, climbed in beside her. What started as casual conversation quickly turned uncomfortable. He began talking about her eyes, telling her how beautiful they were. Then he picked up a pen from the cup holder and began running it along her knees as she sat there in her cut-off sweatpants. She was just a teenager, trapped in a vehicle with an older man whose attention felt predatory and wrong. I was very nervous. She would remember years later. The incident had stayed with her, a moment of vulnerability and fear that she'd carried in silence. But Marilee's story was even more chilling. It was July 1991, nearly 2 years after Mandy's death. Marilee was at home alone with her young son when she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, there stood Tim Bass, claiming he'd been hunting all day and needed to use her phone to call his wife. Something about his presence made her uncomfortable, but she let him in. When she handed him the phone, he dialed a number, but all they heard was the electronic beeping that indicated the call couldn't be completed. The number was disconnected or had never existed at all. Then, Tim's behavior became truly frightening. He walked through her kitchen toward her bedroom, making himself at home in her private space. He told her he used to drive by her house, that he'd always been in love with her, that he wanted to make love to her right then and there. Marilee was terrified. Here was a man who had inserted himself into her home under false pretenses, who was now making sexual advances while her child was nearby. She demanded that he leave, but he refused. Only when she threatened to call the police did he finally go. For more than 20 years, both women had carried these experiences alone, in a small town. Accusing someone of something you couldn't prove was dangerous. Reputations mattered. Families had to live together in the same community. Speaking up without absolute certainty felt impossible. But sitting there in that water park, watching their own children play, they realized they couldn't stay silent any longer. If their suspicions were right, if Tim Bass had killed Mandy Stavik, then their silence was protecting a murderer. They reached out to law enforcement, sharing their stories with Detective Ken Gates, another Mount Baker High graduate who understood the dynamics of their small community. The information was intriguing, but it wasn't evidence. After 24 years, police needed more than suspicions and uncomfortable memories. What they discovered when they began looking into Tim Bass was a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. For the past quarter century, While Mandy's family grieved and the community lived in fear, Tim Bass had been living a quiet, seemingly normal life just miles from where the murder had taken place. He'd gotten married just 6 weeks after Mandy's death, settled down with his wife Gina, and had 3 children. He worked as a delivery driver for a local bakery, making his rounds through the very communities that had been searching for Mandy's killer. He had no significant criminal record. He kept to himself, went to work, came home. To all outward appearances, he was just another small-town family man living an unremarkable life. But the most shocking discovery was where he'd been living in 1989. Tim Bass's family home sat less than 2 miles from Mandy's house, right along one of her regular jogging routes. If he'd been looking out his window on any given day, he could have watched her run past. He could have learned her patterns, her timing, her routine. When police finally approached Bass in 2013, his behavior immediately raised red flags. Asked about Mandy Stavik, he pretended not to remember her at first. Mandy, he said, as if searching his memory. Oh yeah, she was a girl that they found in the river. Who could forget Mandy Stavik in a community the size of Acme? Her murder had been the defining tragedy of their generation. For someone who'd attended the same high school, lived in the same area, to claim he barely remembered her seemed absurd. When investigators asked Bass for a DNA sample, his refusal was immediate and telling. "I don't want to give my DNA," he said. "I watch those crime shows. I see how many people go to prison because they've given DNA." His refusal meant police had to get creative. They put Bass under surveillance, following him on his bakery delivery routes, hoping he would discard something that might contain his DNA. Night after night, they watched and waited. But Bass was careful. He threw nothing away that could be tested. The investigation might have stalled there, but Tim Bass had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the people around him, particularly the women who worked alongside him every day. Kim Wagner was Bass's supervisor at the bakery, and she'd never quite felt comfortable around him. There was something off about the way he interacted with people, especially women. He never called her by name, instead referring to her simply as woman. The smallest things would set him off into angry outbursts, making co-workers wary of being around him. When investigators contacted the bakery and Kim realized they were investigating the Mandy Stavik murder, she put 2 and 2 together. They wanted DNA evidence from Tim Bass, and she was in a position to help them get it. For 3 months, Kim watched and waited, every day. She emptied the trash cans to make sure they were clean, hoping Tim would discard a cup or bottle that might contain his saliva. Every day, she watched him carefully, looking for her opportunity. Finally, it came. She saw him throw away a plastic cup, and later a Coke can. Her heart was racing as she retrieved the items, knowing that she might be handling evidence that could solve one of the most notorious crimes in the region's history. She hid the items in her desk drawer until she could turn them over to police. The wait for test results felt endless. But when Detective Kevin Bowie finally got the call from the state crime lab, the words he heard changed everything. "We've got a match." 28 years after Mandy Stavik's murder, police finally had their killer. The arrest of Timothy Bass on December 12, 2017, sent shockwaves through the community that had waited so long for answers. As Detective Bowie placed the handcuffs on the 50-year-old delivery driver in the bakery parking lot, the weight of nearly 3 decades seemed to lift from the shoulders of everyone who had never forgotten Mandy Stavik. But having a suspect and proving guilt in court are 2 very different things. Bass maintained his innocence, and his defense team was prepared to fight every piece of evidence the prosecution presented. When confronted with the DNA match, Bass's story began to evolve in ways that shocked even seasoned investigators. The man who had initially claimed he barely remembered Mandy suddenly had a very different tale to tell. He now insisted that he and Mandy had been having a secret affair, that their encounter had been consensual. It was a desperate gambit, one that required the jury to believe that an 18-year-old college freshman would have willingly engaged in a relationship with a man she'd never been seen with, never called, never mentioned to family or friends. The defense argued that DNA evidence only proved contact had occurred, not that a crime had been committed. But the prosecution had more than just DNA. They had a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture of Timothy Bass. His own family members took the stand against him, describing a man who had shown disturbing attitudes toward women throughout his life. His ex-wife testified about years of controlling, abusive behavior. His brother revealed how Bass had asked him to lie to police, even suggesting they blame their deceased father for the crime. Perhaps most damning was the testimony from Kim Wagner, the brave woman who had helped police obtain the crucial DNA evidence. Her decision to act had been driven by a simple principle: doing what was right for Mandy. The trial lasted 9 days, but the jury's deliberation was mercifully brief. After just 5 hours, they returned with their verdict guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and first-degree kidnapping. 29 years and 6 months after Mandy Stavik was found floating in the Nooksack River, justice had finally been served. At his sentencing, Bass continued to proclaim his innocence, but Judge Evan Chaffee was unmoved. He sentenced Bass to nearly 27 years in prison, ensuring that the man who had stolen so much from so many would spend the rest of his meaningful life behind bars. For Mandy's family, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and continued grief. Her mother, Mary, who had spent decades wondering if she would ever see justice for her daughter, finally had her answer. Her sister, Molly, who had carried the pain of loss for so long, could finally begin to heal. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt by the community of Acme itself. The arrest and conviction of Timothy Bass didn't just solve a murder case. It gave back something that had been stolen from them nearly 30 years earlier. The fear that had shadowed their daily lives, the suspicion that had tainted their interactions, the loss of innocence that had changed their community forever. None of that could be completely undone, but they could finally stop looking over their shoulders. They could finally trust that the monster who had walked among them was where he belonged. The case of Mandy Stavik became more than just a murder investigation. It became a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of community, and the courage of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. From Detective Bowie, who never gave up on a case that others had written off, to Kim Wagner, who risked her own safety to help catch a killer, to the two mothers at a water park who finally found the courage to speak up. It took a village to bring Timothy Bass to justice. Today, Acme remains a small, close-knit community nestled in the shadow of the mountains. Children still play outside until the streetlights come on. Neighbors still help neighbors. And while the scars of November 1989 will never completely fade, the people of this town have reclaimed something precious: the knowledge that evil may find its way into paradise, but it cannot stay hidden forever. Mandy Stavik was just 18 years old when her life was cut short, but her legacy lives on in the justice that was finally served and in the community that never forgot her name. In the end, love proved stronger than fear, truth more powerful than lies, and justice, though delayed, would not be denied. This was the case no one could forget, and now, finally. No one has to.